This is Transqat, a safe space to stand. Transgender issues, queer people, respectful conversations. I'm host Claire McCarthy. Welcome to Transqat. Today's guest is Logan Ward, a Boston area illustrator and director of the short documentary Remarkable: Voices from the Transgender Community. Now, as I mentioned last episode, I recommend watching the film before you listen to today's conversation. It's only about 30 minutes long, and you can access it via transqat.com. Before we begin, though, I want to acknowledge some awful news that emerged in February. It's graphic, so if you'd rather not hear it, or if children are listening, I suggest skipping ahead. Sam Nordquist was a trans man from Minnesota. He left home in September to visit someone with whom he had an online relationship. When he didn't return as scheduled, or answer calls or texts, his mom tried to get information and help for her son. There was a series of odd, seemingly scripted phone conversations. Sam's remains were found in a field in upper New York State on February 13th. Police reports say that he endured prolonged physical and psychological torture at the hands of multiple individuals over the course of weeks. According to police reports, the suspects reportedly sexually assaulted Nordquist with a table leg and a broomstick, and they beat him with sticks and ropes and belts before he succumbed to his injuries. New York State Police Captain Kelly Swift said this was, quote, one of the most horrific crimes I have ever investigated. 5 people have been arrested and charged with second-degree murder and depraved indifference. Police say that at present they have no evidence that this was a hate crime. I'm in no position to interpret these facts, and it's not my place to tell you what to think or feel. Instead, I offer a moment of silence for Sam Nordquist. So this, I haven't had a chance to talk to you since I've seen it. This documentary is remarkable, pun intended. But have you submitted it to the Out Film here in Connecticut yet?
Yes, yeah. Oh. I missed the early deadline, but it's in now, and I'm hoping to submit it to a lot more places as well. So look out for it. I'm Logan Ward. I'm a trans man, illustrator, filmmaker, writer, and right now a social media manager for Restorative Justice on the Rise. I live just north of Boston.
And you and I met at Boston Pride this year. Very fortuitous meeting. We ended up filming each other and recording each other. And
yeah. And I had been wandering around Pride and wanting to do an interview with someone, but it felt very unnatural, and I didn't want to put a spotlight on someone that is just hanging out and having a good time. So I really appreciated that you had already this microphone set up and you were inviting dialogue, because then I knew you were already consenting to something like that. So yeah, I really appreciated that conversation. And you were a great example too of trans people making our own media. And so I really appreciated having you a part of the story.
Where did this project come from? How did you bring it to being?
So I came up with the idea and created it as a part of my master's thesis. I finished my thesis, and then the film didn't feel done yet, so I continued to work on it. So actually, I'm not sure if it's even, does it qualify as a student film? I'm not sure. It's not like I was in film school. I mean, so I was in a program that focused on community-centered and participatory methods. And so I was learning all of this stuff. And the thesis, they were wanting us to create a project where we would work with a community and we could provide tools to them. And I was so aware at the time, of course, of everything going on with the trans community. And so as a member of the community, I took the tools I was learning and then I applied them to my own project, which was basically what we're supposed to help communities do. And instead I just did it myself, right? So it wasn't a participatory method that I use to create the project, but I'm hoping that it helps people understand that that's a way to go about things so that that could be used in more settings and other people can use it.
Well, as you said, people within the community creating their own media helps offset some of the misinformation and the disinformation. It creates a space for authentic lived experience. You Hitchcock like put yourself in the documentary in a few spots. I particularly was impressed with your conversation with your trans friend who went through some struggles. But let me come back to that though. You pulled some big names in. I mean, I when I saw this, I was so grateful that we had crossed paths, because to be in the same documentary with P. Carl and with Julia Serrano, that's an honor. How did you get some of these big names?
I was starstruck by both of them. I had to reel it in a little bit because I mean, I think of them as so influential within the community, and I've been reading Julia Serrano for a while, and all of the ideas that Julia Serrano had written about in all these different books, Excluded, Whipping Girl, and Sexed Up. I mean, that opened up this whole door of realizing assumptions I was applying to myself and things that I wasn't accepting about myself, and really just starting to think about my own gender identity in a more positive way. I think that's so hard to do in a world where we're completely, like, constantly bombarded with negative messages around this stuff. And so I would be curious actually to have another conversation with both of them about how they do that and like share so openly and stay so calm, and particularly Julia continuing to put out news updates and opinion pieces about all of the most recent news.
What, in terms of personal message, what did you take from Julia's writing? She sort of lays the groundwork for the thesis of your documentary. She lays out even the word that will come to be the title. But on a personal level, what did she teach you?
The whole concept of not believing trans identities, of trans people saying what our identities are, and then having people come up with what they think are our intentions. And that was something Julia Serrano really taught me and helped me see was, I would get worried about, I mean, everybody every day worries about how they say things and how it will be perceived by people. And recognizing that someone's interpretation of what you're saying, that's not your burden to bear, right? And that is so logical, and you never hear it applied to trans identities. And I just loved that sort of, like, it felt like this freeing truth that, like, had never been said and needed to be said, which is just, yeah, all of these assumptions about our intentions and why we transition. I transitioned because I wanted to, and I'm allowed to do that. So, it's as
Right.
simple as that.
Because it does get layered on us. I am really struggling of late with, I know we're not supposed to say TERF anymore, but is it gender critical feminism, I think is the acceptable term. The sorts of things that a certain British author of fantasy keeps putting out there, that trans women are just imitating real women, that we're lesser, we are not authentic. And I struggle with that. I am found myself lately, I'm afraid to put on makeup because that's going to be interpreted as me trying to be something I'm not. I find myself afraid to do more feminine gestures in that it will be perceived as somehow mocking or
Yeah.
inauthentic again, and that I need to take that message to heart. I can choose to wear makeup, I can choose not to, I can accessorize, I can not, and that's just my decision.
I relate to that so much, that feeling of I feel comfortable performing a certain way, performing gender a certain way, and then getting in my head about how that's being perceived. And this is something that Pete Carl really emphasized. And I don't think that this part was in the documentary, but we had such a long, wonderful conversation. I tried to put so much of it into the documentary, right? But he said at one point to me, like, everybody's performing gender. And this is a part of his book as well. I mean, it's
Yeah.
all that's what gender is. It's this performance, and that's okay. We perform things in our lives constantly. I mean, manners and polite exchanges, small talk, and that sort of thing. I mean, it's there's so much of social interaction is performance, and that's okay. And for the fantasy author you mentioned to speak as
I
if,
can't remember her name. I'm
yeah,
sorry. I
who is
can't.
that? Yeah.
No.
For her to act as if she is separate from that just isn't true. I mean, she also performs gender, and if she were to wear less makeup or to do it differently, that would still be a version of gender performance, and that you can't really escape it as much as many people may want to. I mean, there's going to be an interpretation of it in some way. So,
One of the things that Pete Carl's book really, as I recall, it's been a few years since I read it, but as I recall, covered really well is there's a line for an individual, and I want to ask you about this, between your performance of masculinity and what one might call toxic masculinity. There is a way of being a man, particularly in American culture right now, that is not necessarily admirable. Do you find yourself working to find that line where you're this is me as a man, this is how I carry myself, this is how I'm going to interact when I sit down with Claire at the Pride Festival, but not have it spill over into testosterone poisoning?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, this for me is where the areas of sexuality and gender seem to cross and connect a little bit too, because I feel like there's so many different gender expressions within sexuality, and when I act certain ways, I start to wonder, well, what does this mean for my sexuality? And then I'm like, well, that's exactly what they want you to think, right? They want you to be confused about,
Right.
right. So, I mean, but I really so often like where I end up comfortable with my gender, like would qualify under like this like gay man kind of like, I like scarves and sweaters and all of the if stereotypical gay man things that we could say. I don't want to perpetuate those, but there's just this sort of quality of femininity within my masculinity that I love and enjoy, and I think it's just like a natural part of my masculinity, right? There's this gentleness within me that feels a part of my masculinity, and I think part of that's also, I mean, my father was a a family therapist. He's a couples counselor. My mom is a social worker. I mean, I grew up in Vermont. I attended Unitarian Universalist church growing up, so I was always surrounded by really positive male figures in my life. I think that the as I've moved to Boston now, there's like new associations that I have where I'm like, oh, doing this, which feels natural to me, might be thought of as a gay thing to do. And, I identify as queer, so that's fine. But also, I mean, it is crazy how all these assumptions, as we're talking about, can be put upon us based on just how we're expressing ourselves. And I mean, yeah, I don't want to be thought of as a toxic man. I don't want to be a toxic man. I want to consume media though that many of my male friends consume, right? So then watching shows or listening to rap music and, not always agreeing with what is within that media. And so really making an active effort to remind myself of where I come from and who I am and what I believe so that I'm not perpetuating these things I hear and consume.
that's part of, we're using the verb perform, but it really has a lot more to do with all of the messages that you ingest from your community, your church, your parents, your playground, your what you watch on TV and movies, and what you listen to, and then you sort of sift through that and decide what is pertinent to you and what is not. And I think everybody does that. You know, if you look to the screen, Jason Momoa is a man. Tom Hanks is a man. You would not confuse those two in terms of the way they approach things, the way they hold themselves, speak, you know, but they're well within that normal range of masculinity. Let me go back to Julia Serrano, because as I say, she sets up this idea that I loved about the marked versus the unmarked. By her standards, are we, you and I, marked or unmarked?
Definitely marked in today's current world, but there's also this other aspect to it where it's each person's individual marking of people. She has this diagram as well where it's like the stages of acceptance. There's the earlier stages not really accepting people, and that's where you're still marking people, whether it's unconscious or conscious. And then you can move up the stages of acceptance. And I mean, it's a person to person thing, because people who are in the fully accepting stage of trans people would consider us as unmarked, right? So each person will create their own groups of people who are marked and people who are unmarked.
For those who would prefer not to come to terms with those of us who are marked either by race or gender or religion, it becomes a way of moving us to the margins. And more, the people who consider themselves unmarked start to feel justified in saying, no, I'm the norm.
Yeah. Yeah.
What I am is what you should be trying to be like. And the more you are not, the more on the margins you are.
And it's interesting to me, the kind of pushback from the word cisgender. I understand if someone's never heard the word before and then someone says, you're cisgender. I would understand the confusion. You don't really identify with it because you just don't know it. But I think it'd be important for us to create more spaces where cisgender is used more regularly. And this is why I think it's so essential that trans allies use the word cis when referring to themselves, because I don't hear many people use the word cis at all. And when I hear it used, it does tend to be in situations where we're comparing trans and cis people, and then cis people are sort of this bad entity that is and
yeah, all right.
I understand. I mean, that in those discussions that it's essential to label each group so that we can understand which group you're talking about. I mean, that's part of writing, but it is too bad that it's not a positive label for a lot of cis people. I wish that it were, because there's nothing wrong with being cis. I mean, that's just,
No.
So I wish that it would be something people would identify with.
Yeah, I think it does, particularly in this culture of people on the right acting out against being woke. I think it becomes portrayed as, oh, well, those marked people on the margins are trying to make us feel bad about ourselves. And so they've come up with this phony word cis, where we don't really need it. And I think a lot of them feel as if, yeah, we're attacking them somehow, when in fact all we're saying is, no, there are people who are comfortable with the gender that they were assigned at birth, and there are those of us who are not, and who really struggle to come to grips with that here's what I've been assigned, but it's not me.
And also the word comes before the gender, right? So that's part of it too, where I can't remember his name, the What is a Woman documentary that's done. but he goes around and he asks people, what's a woman? And it's so strange to me because we have cis women and we have trans women, and both, like, the word women is included in both labels. So he's trying to out vocabularize them. He's trying to like make it like, oh, it's too logical. This is what a woman is, but there's always this parentheses cis before women, and that's just not always written. So it's, what is a woman? What do you mean, cis or trans?
Right. And it's, pretty much any one characteristic of being a woman that a person on the street interview might come up with. There are exceptions to that. When folks talk about trans women athletes, the thing that gets thrown at them is, well, you don't menstruate, so you're not a real woman. Well, prepubertal, perimenopausal, postmenopausal women don't menstruate either.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean they're less of a woman. Your grandmother is still a woman.
Right. It all comes back to just, why can't we just trust when someone wants to identify a certain way? And why can't we just respect that? And that was really the core message I wanted to get across in the documentary, was just listening to trans people and respecting their ways of identifying themselves.
Today's episode of Transqat is brought to you by Sam Avery Media. Art is powerful. It's how we tell our stories, how we take up space, how we make the world see us. And that's exactly what Sam Avery Media is all about. The owner, Samuel Avery, is a trans photographer, artist, and filmmaker using art as advocacy, not just through his self-portraits, but through his editorial portrait work. Through his lens, Sam captures the raw, beautiful, and unapologetic truth of trans lives, turning our experience into art that speaks louder than words. Your story deserves to be seen. So let Sam help you bring it to life. Book your session now at samaverymedia.com.
Well, Eric Gordon, who also recurs throughout the film, I thought had a really good handle on that in terms of conducting research, because research is knowledge. When people start debating back and forth about, no, gender is like this, no, it's like this, we go to scientific studies, we go to properly obtained data and say, okay, that is knowledge. And he, I thought, really explained well the pitfalls of, you've got to be careful how you ask the questions. Are you assuming that you, as the outsider, somehow have more authority than the community you're studying?
Learning that in my program was so essential to me as well. Realizing that all of these lack of solutions that work for everybody is really this lack of dialogue between people who are all impacted, right? So if we come up with a solution to trans athletes that doesn't work for trans people, well, it's because trans people weren't involved in the decision-making process. If we actually have everybody who's gonna be impacted in the room together, they're all gonna let you know why something doesn't work. I really enjoyed those aspects as well, and Marika Nazer also had a really amazing section. She worked with a ton of young trans and intersex youth and had amazing conversations with them. And, she even said to me, well, I'm not a community-centered researcher, officially. I just want you to know that. And I told her, I think what you're doing is amazing work, and you're trying to bring those values in as much as you can into your field. And that's what I'm hoping other people will do as well, right? Because you can't ask that every institution implement it perfectly as a restorative or community-centered approach, but you can ask that they bring those values in.
Well, she raised, I thought very effectively, the point that you and I talked about in Boston. To access gender-affirming care, or any sort of services as a trans person, we end up having to prove ourselves to cis people. And that was the conversation you and I started at the table that day, where gender dysphoria is listed in the DSM, and you have to meet that, even though the language has improved over volumes 2, 3, 4, 5, you still have to prove yourself to a medical professional to get in the door. And that medical professional, I don't know, 8 times out of 10, 9 times out of 10, is a cishet person.
Yeah, it was so strange to me to think about having to get this approval, first of all, from a cis person. I mean, I'm living in Boston, so around me, the doctors and therapists that treat me are pretty well versed, but they're still cis. That in itself is going to add a layer of bias. They're reading information. And so I started to think about, well, okay, so what if we had trans practitioners? And I mean, if we just remove the whole barrier together, we just,
Right.
why don't we just let trans people decide what's best for their bodies and then they can do that? I mean,
my endocrinologist is cis, but she very much leads with questions. She starts with me, what I need, what the reactions are. But then I rely on her in terms of dosage. And if I were to start developing adverse effects to this or that, I would rely on her to tell me the medical end of things. But she always starts with questions. And she runs the gender clinic here in Middlesex County. And she will very often include me in speaking engagements because she recognizes that, yes, on one level, I'm an expert, but I'm not trans. So let's make sure that this voice is there. And that seems to me to be best practices.
And really respecting the other person is a huge part of it. You're so right. I mean, if we can't give full autonomy to trans people, we are your equals,
I'd settle for that.
Yeah.
That would be fine.
That'd be pretty great, yeah.
The Transqat store is now open. We're starting small, a few stickers and a bookmark designed by Transqat executive producer The Lady Bethesda, but we'll be adding more items as we go. To shop now, go to transqat.com, find support on the main menu, and then select store. We've also moved the sponsorship opportunities to the store so that everything can be in one place. The donate option is available under the support tab as well. Thanks in advance for supporting the show.
One of the things that Eric Gordon brought up, he didn't say this, but my mind went to the space program, in that when we first sent people to the moon, there was a fair amount of pushback that this is not where we should be spending the money. But what came from NASA and what came from the space program is all these applications for medicine. And Eric Gordon talks about the fact that in listening to and actually working toward the needs of the people on the margin, you will have ancillary benefits. You will learn more about medicine in general to apply to the folks who are in the center as opposed to the margin.
Absolutely. And I mentioned this also in there's a companion piece to the documentary where I did an episode with on the Restorative Justice on the Ride podcast. You can check it out. Hammond, Samba, and I chatted with the Restorative Rainbow Alliance from Colorado. I mentioned in there that within my research, I found that there's this Planned Parenthood released spot on, and that was for period tracking. But they decided to listen to the Tumblr community, which was full of trans people and were advocating for gender neutral visuals and words. And so they released this dinosaur, and they had blue background. And, you know, when I walk through the designs, I start thinking about how it's less gender neutral and almost seems like boy centric. It was described as gender neutral in the article, and everybody was saying that they really liked the gender neutral things because it didn't feel like it was like performing something to them about how they should be feeling when they're on their periods. And I thought that that was a great example of when you create something gender neutral or listen to trans voices, people benefited from that.
Well, that you see that, and with a cool sense of humor now, very often with especially single occupancy public bathrooms, you know, in your Cumberland Farms or wherever, where they've got a sillier sign where you've got the two traditional, you know, person wearing a triangle, person not wearing a triangle, but then all these progressively weirder shapes, you know, a Bigfoot and an alien, and at the bottom saying, yeah, whatever, just wash your hands.
Right. Yeah.
And you can, so that you can bring these topics up with a sense of humor, which disarms, and a sense of, so when I look at that, yeah, I get a chuckle, but I also realize, okay, this company recognizes that I'm a little cautious about which bathroom I'm supposed to use in public sometimes.
Yeah, yeah. They're thinking about how it must feel, and they want to create that space for it to just be like, whatever, it's just a bathroom. Do what you got to do.
I want to get to some of the actual filmmaking of this, as well as the themes. I'm going to say it's about halfway through. There was a very effective montage of hateful comments from public figures, and it was very effective because I got angry listening to watching it. And I forget what the visuals are in the background. You have a lot of you had a lot of access to really cool clips that you put in, but that segment moved me. It just was a reminder of what I thought for somebody who was cis and het watching this, that, what is it, minute and a half of film gave you a really good sense of what it's like to be trans and listening to the news these days.
There are people who are afraid to be who they are. There are people who are afraid to walk out of their doors.
McDaniel says anti-trans rhetoric and initiatives, political or not, only fuel violence.
What's the definition of a woman? Well, a woman is someone who by her nature can conceive children in her womb and bear children.
There's a mockery of a woman, and let's be real, he looks like a man. If you're watching that video, he looked like a man who was wearing a wig with pigtails. He's not fooling anybody.
Oh my God, look at the size of her.
This is mental illness, and in children it may merely be confusion or emotional disturbance, but when you reach the adult stage, this is mental illness.
What is wrong with them?
I will ask Congress to pass a bill establishing that the only genders recognized by the United States government are male and female, and they are assigned at birth.
Oh, I so appreciate that, because that's what I was hoping to do, to really add an emotion to it that almost felt like, yeah, cis people could understand what it's like. I mean, it is so disheartening to like see what's in the news. I mean, just as you said, and I mean, yeah, and consuming all of that anti-trans rhetoric, I had to take a step back quite a bit during the project, because it, you know, taking all this stuff in, and initially a lot of those videos were put all throughout the documentary, and I realized that I just felt so stressed whenever I came into contact with those videos that it actually was keeping me from editing the project. And so I needed to condense them. Like, this was one section, and I actually got the idea from Will and Harper, which is the film, Will Ferrell and his friend Harper there, and they have this scene where they're driving, and the anti-trans rhetoric is playing. And I was, of course, you know, hit by the negativity of what was being said in the news, but I felt all okay with it, and I could handle hearing it because I wasn't watching these angry faces. I was looking at a car on a road. And so that's what gave me the idea of like, I think I can swallow this hard pill if I'm looking at metaphors, visual metaphors.
I can't remember the exact sequencing of it, but it might have been right towards the end of that. There's a still of Next Benedict. Here's all this rhetoric, and here's the result of it.
And I was so struck by that story too, because even in the news today, it's labeled as a suicide because they took something so minuscule. It's like an Advil and a Tylenol. And it's like, because those were in their bloodstream, it's labeled a suicide. I mean, they had a headache, you know? It was so clearly brain injury. And I was able to get in contact with someone to ask him, Jason Anderson, to film at the vigil. Sent me a ton of footage, and I didn't end up being able to use a ton of it because I think it would have been too hard to focus too much on all of the deaths within the community. And there's just, that could be its own documentary in itself. So,
but it brings us back to where we started in terms of making our own media, because that's the story gets spun that no, this wasn't the result of bullying. This wasn't the result of a TBI sustained in the school's bathroom. Next went home and killed themselves. And the same thing happened back in the 90s after Matt Shepard died. This horrific torture and murder. And the other side really felt that that would somehow be mitigated if they could prove, well, he dealt drugs occasionally, or he was there to do a deal with the ones that killed him, as if by somehow trying to sully his public image, that would make what happened to him okay.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Because it wouldn't, it doesn't matter if they stole drugs. It doesn't matter if Next Benedict did commit suicide the day afterwards, because at the end of the day, they were bullied horrifically the day before. And so that is the reason that they died. It is like, exactly. It's trying to be turned into this demonizing of them selling drugs or mental health issues. Similar, all of this markedness stuff, the theory applies, they're trying to turn it into something else.
And it's a tactic that's been used forever. It's the same tactic that was used against accusations of rape for years. You were somehow asking for this. The way you dressed, the way, where you were at what time. Well, that you were asking for it. It's your fault. And this let's blame the victim thing, you'd think we would be on to that strategy by now and just kind of dismiss it out of hand. But it works.
Julia Serrano was saying that's part of why this markedness theory was something she felt that was so essential, is because there are so many situations where we think we're aware of how to identify marginalization, but we're focused on singular phrases and words, blaming the victim. That is a phrase that we okay, I know this is not something we should do, but it when it's twisted in a certain way, I mean, it can be hard to recognize. So yeah, just being able to lay it all out, these are the categories. This is still marginalization.
You're trying to justify your behavior doesn't change that.
Yeah.
There was a clip, and I wrote this down. It's at 15:30, almost exactly midway through.
Or being artificial or inauthentic. And then a final one that I dedicated my entire book Sexed Up to is sexualization, where we tend to view some people as excessively sexual or marked by sex in some way. With trans people have lots of questions about us and they scrutinize trans people.
And you, like I say, you have this great series of video clips, and this one struck me. It's a black and white clip of a black trans woman. She's on the street and is looking in the window of a shop. And in the foreground of the shot is this guy. The clip is very fast, but he clocks her for who she is and gives the camera this look that, with no dialogue, says everything. Says, I know who you are. I think you're ridiculous. You used so many clips. I don't know if you know what that is or where it's from, but that one struck me.
I can't remember off the top of my head the name of the clip, but I used mostly the Prelinger archives on the Internet Archive. I think it was from the 50s or 60s. I pulled that in because of Julia Serrano, again, mentioning so many trans women are shown on TV as dressing, putting on makeup. You know, it's the scenes of performing gender there, but you know, proving that they aren't always that way. They're putting it on. Now they're a woman, you know, and so that is part of why that clip and that woman was also in, when the Marketness word shows up, it says inauthentic. Yeah, that's why I brought that clip in. And then there's a whole relationship within the film between those two people. They get to know each other. So it's actually so bizarre that that's the reaction that he has. It's almost like he's with his friends, I think, and that's his public reaction, but then he goes on a date with her. So,
wow.
Yeah, I'll have to find it. You could link it to the podcast.
Please. Oh,
yeah.
I would love to see it. Yeah. As you were just describing this, I hadn't thought of this before, but that depiction of trans, it's almost always trans women. You don't see trans men depicted this way, but that montage of putting on the femme, it's the exact same thing that they do in superhero movies. Every Batman movie, Deadpool parodies it, right? But there's a montage of putting on the gear, putting on the mask, and now I'm ready to be that alter ego. And that's, I'm just realizing now that that's the difference, is that we're not putting on an alter ego.
Yeah. That it's a part of who we are. And it's done the same, similarly with cis women, like way back when media was still very stereotypical and we saw a lot more often this like putting on the makeup, and we've kind of moved out of that, but now like that misogyny is still being applied to trans women. So here we are again. I think with, I mean, non-binary people and trans men, it's often the showing the photo of them pre-transition.
Oh,
you know,
yeah, deadly.
Yeah, look how much they've changed. And I showed that photo of me and my friend Alex in the documentary, and we had a conversation about it because, you know, we're both hesitant to want to show a photo of ourselves and perpetuate that kind of like, look at how they've changed. And then we, in our conversation, realized that this is actually a very natural reason to show a photo of us pre-transition. This is us as friends together. We already knew each other, and now we're doing an interview, right? And so we realized it could be a great way to demonstrate like a healthy way of showing someone pre-transition if the occasion calls for an image of this person younger. That's would make sense. You'd use a photo, but don't use the photo just to prove they're trans, you know?
Anytime a famous trans person steps into the spotlight, the internet is filled with that. Those side-by-side pics, yes, the before and after, so that everybody can ooh and like, oh, wow. You know, that I'm thinking of the documentary was Lady Valor, so a former, I think was a SEAL. And, you know, and so the before picture was incredibly masculine with the ragged beard, and the weapon, and then the after photo. And it's just there to get a prurient rise out of people.
Yeah. And most trans people would probably say, yeah, that was like not how I dressed on a daily basis, you know? Or like I was wearing that because my sister's hand-me-downs were the only clothes available to me that day, you know? Like, it's this acting as if that's what our lives were like, and that's just not the truth usually.
Tell people where they can access Remarkable.
It can be accessed on YouTube at Remarkable Film, and also I have an Instagram and TikTok account for it, which I'm promoting, and if you can share all the reels and TikToks that I post, let's try to get this thing out there.
Yeah, I think before we started rolling, you were talking about getting it out to film festivals and hopefully getting it seen by a broader audience.
That's the goal of 2025, just trying to get this thing out there. Yeah.
It would be great. I have some friends that I've met throughout Film Connecticut, and they travel, you know, they make short films and then travel around to these different festivals, and it feeds itself. You know, you get more ideas for stories, you connect with other like-minded people who are trying to create art and tell stories.
Awesome. I'm excited then.
What's next? Last question. What's next?
I will be continuing to promote and post about the documentary. I plan to be writing and illustrating as this year comes up. I have a Medium account, which I plan to be writing more on, and also illustration Instagram account. I don't know all the tags for the Medium, so I'll just say that everything can be accessed on my website, loganward.net.
But I do have links to the film on my website. So hopefully, yeah, let's get people out there to see this thing and start talking about it more.
Yeah, I would love that. Thank you so much for having me, Claire. I really appreciate it.
Next up is a conversation with poet, essayist, literary scholar, and trans woman Joy Ladin. Joy was the first openly trans person to be an employee of an Orthodox Jewish institution. Housekeeping items. Last episode, we spoke to Robin McCallan about SojiCon 2025. I'll be presenting 2 panels at the conference, one about queer history trivia and one on the state of gender-affirming care for trans youth here in Connecticut. On the 29th, I'll be participating in Middlesex Health's Day of Gifts. That stands for Getting Information for Trans Support. You can register at middlesexhealth.org/gifts, GIFTS. Friend of the show, Kim Adamski, and I are locking in dates for our queer sex and kink trivia events this spring. The dates will be in April and May. We have one scheduled in New Haven and a second one just lined up in Chester. If you know of a venue that would like to host, reach out to transqat.com. This has been Transqat. I'm Claire McCarthy. Thank you for listening. Let's talk soon.
This is Sadie McCarthy. I'm Claire's niece.
And you've just been listening to Transqat. It is made by one of my favorite people in the world, Claire McCarthy.
Transqat is a production of Transqat Enterprises, LLC.
Copyright 2023, all rights reserved.
Join us on the web at transqat.com.
That's TRANSQAT.com.
QAT.com.
QAT.com.
There you'll find links to Transqat, the blog,
writing projects,
speaking engagements,
and our PayPal donations page.
Please consider supporting our mission with your monkeys.
Monies. Your monies.
Your monies. Not monkeys.
Please consider supporting our mission with your monies. Any monkeys will be gratefully received as well.
Follow Transqat on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube.
On TikTok, we are at The Real Transqat.
Want to tell your story on air?
Or ask Claire a question?
What is the deal?
She has all the answers.
Or suggest a guest or topic for an upcoming episode.
Use the contact page at the website
or email her directly at crmtranscat@gmail.com.
crmtranscat@gmail.com.
And thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening. Bye.